What if humanity's greatest age of prosperity was shattered, not by one enemy, but by two, one from its distant past and another from beyond the stars? This is the story of Sins of a Solar Empire, a galaxy locked in endless war, where the sins of exile and empire return to haunt the present. Unlike many strategy games, Sins of a Solar Empire doesn't hand you a linear campaign. Instead, its lore is woven through backstory, world building, and the conflicts of three unique factions. But when pieced together, the timeline stretches over 10,000 years of history, an epic saga of rise, fall, exile, and revenge. At the center of it all are three powers. The first is the Trader Emergency Coalition, descendants of humanity's trade order. Prosperous merchants turned reluctant warriors. The second is the Vasari Empire, an ancient alien civilization that once ruled the galaxy, but now survives as refugees fleeing an unstoppable terror. And finally, there is the Advent Unity, humanity's exiled cousins, cast out for their so-called deviancy, and returning a millennium later, wielding psionics and burning with a thirst for vengeance. These factions collide in a struggle that spans centuries, with no clear victor in sight. And looming over it all is a greater question: what destroyed the Vasari's empire, and how long until it arrives in Trader space? This is the complete lore, history, and timeline of Sins of a Solar Empire. It is, in my view, one of the most underrated strategy games ever made, standing proudly alongside Supreme Commander and Command & Conquer as one of my personal favorites. So without further ado, let us begin. "10,000 years before the present conflict, the Visari Empire was the undisputed master of the galaxy. From the burning heart of the galactic core, their dark fleet expanded like a tide of iron, bringing system after system under their dominion. Their approach was efficient, merciless, and unrelenting. Primitive worlds were subdued with ease, their populations indoctrinated into Vasari society as second-class citizens. More advanced civilizations fought back, but resistance only meant enslavement. Towering orbital structures were placed above conquered planets, symbols of permanent domination and the ever-watchful presence of the Vasari. To those who lived under their shadow, the empire appeared eternal. To outside observers, it was unimaginable that such a vast, disciplined machine of conquest could ever be brought down. Yet collapse did come, swift and inexplicable. It began as whispers, strange reports trickling in from the core worlds of sudden silences and vanished communications. At first, the Vasari elite dismissed the news as rebellion. Local fleets were dispatched to restore order, but they never returned. Then more worlds went dark. In weeks, whole sectors were gone, their defenses erased without explanation. Finally, the Vasari homeworld itself fell silent. In desperation, the Dark Fleet Veer mobilized for a massive counter-offensive, the greatest force the Empire had ever assembled, and hurled itself into the abyss. Only one warship came back. It limped from phase space, battered and broken, carrying a crew reduced to gibbering terror. They could not say what they had seen, only that it was unstoppable. Panic swept across the Empire like wildfire. In a single desperate act of survival, the Vasari abandoned their empire entirely. This was the Exodus. Civilian vessels were stripped of purpose and re-engineered into carriers of life. Capital ships were retrofitted as arks, every cubic meter filled with desperate survivors. Billions were left behind to die as the Exodus fleet fled. Entire cultures were condensed into fragments, carried forward by a civilization that no longer thought of glory or conquest, but of survival alone. For the next 10,000 years, the Vasari became wanderers. They arrived in system after system, stripping planets of resources with ruthless efficiency before moving on. Every time they paused, they left warning beacons behind, desperate messages carved into the stars for anyone who might follow. Yet one by one, those beacons too went silent, consumed by the same advancing darkness that had destroyed their empire. While the Vasari fled across the stars, humanity walked its own turbulent path. Little is known about humanity's earliest history, but surviving fragments suggest that around 7,500 years before the present age, they maintained a massive star-spanning empire in a region of space untouched by alien contact. For centuries, this empire thrived on exploration, colonization, and the binding power of centralized authority. It was a time of bold expansion and technological progress, an age when humankind believed itself secure as master of its own destiny. Spread across dozens of star systems, great cities rose on alien worlds, and a web of fleets and trade routes held together a civilization that seemed destined to last forever. That confidence ended with the Great Schism. This catastrophe was not a single war or disaster, but a cascading collapse brought on by civil wars, ideological rivalries, and desperate competition for resources. Internal divisions shattered the empire's unity. Political factions hardened into enemies. Trade networks collapsed under the weight of mutual distrust. Entire sectors were plunged into chaos as star lanes became battlefields. In the darkness that followed, famine and plague cut down billions more. Planets that had once thrived became isolated fortresses ruled by warlords or crumbling into anarchy. Technology regressed as knowledge was lost, hoarded, or destroyed. In the collective memory of humankind, this disaster burned itself into legend as an age when empire died and survival itself was no longer guaranteed. The scars of the Great Schism lasted for centuries. Whole generations lived and died with no memory of the unity their ancestors had once enjoyed. For many, stories of the fallen empire became half-forgotten myths, whispered in fragmented histories and scattered archives. What had been a shining dominion of humanity was reduced to a collection of struggling worlds, cut off from each other, each one forced to rebuild in isolation. Yet out of this devastation, something new began to emerge. The survivors slowly rebuilt, piecing together knowledge and commerce from the wreckage of fallen states. Over the course of millennia, fractured worlds forged new connections. What rose was not another emperor or sprawling human imperium, but something far more practical, a consortium of merchants, settlers, and planetary leaders who bound themselves together not through conquest, but through trade. Around 1500 years ago, this loose coalition crystallized into the Trade Order, a framework that would define humanity's golden age and replace the shattered dreams of empire. Independent planets, each proud of their sovereignty and wary of repeating the mistakes of empire, agreed to submit to shared laws in exchange for prosperity and security. Courtrooms and boardrooms replaced battlefields. Sanctions and tariffs became the weapons of choice. For centuries, this brought stability and prosperity unimaginable to those who had endured the schism. This age of prosperity stretched for nearly 1,000 years. Piracy remained a nuisance, but the trade order's fleets kept it under control. Children grew up never knowing famine or invasion, raised in an age of constant abundance. The flow of goods, knowledge, and culture across phase space lulled humanity into the belief that war itself had been consigned to the past. But beneath the gleaming surface of trade and law lay a hidden fragility. Humanity thought itself secure, but the very policies that maintained its peace planted the seeds of a future reckoning. If the Vasari embody fear of the unknown, then the Advent represent the sins of humanity's past, returning to collect their due. Their story begins 1,000 years before the current war, during the height of the Trade Order's prosperity. While the Order thrived on peace and commerce, it was governed by strict codes of conduct. Entire branches of science, psionics, radical augmentation, experimental biotechnology were outlawed as unnatural and dangerous. The justification was stability. Leaders feared that unchecked experimentation would destabilize the carefully balanced network of trade and law. To the wider public, these decrees seemed like moral safeguards. To those who lived differently, they were oppression. Any who defied these laws faced not only sanction, but complete banishment. On a remote desert world orbiting a red star, one human civilization chose precisely the path the Trade Order forbade. They pursued psionics openly, unlocking latent abilities of the mind and amplifying them with cybernetic integration. They experimented with communal consciousness, fusing minds into a shared whole. creating a society that functioned less like a collection of individuals and more like a living organism. To outsiders, this was grotesque. To the people themselves, it was transcendence, a means of elevating humanity beyond isolation and selfishness. Shocked and appalled, the trade order resolved not to annihilate them, but to cast them out. The punishment was exile. The people of the desert world were driven far beyond the edges of trader space, severed from their kin, stripped of recognition, and abandoned. Intended to preserve harmony, the decision instead planted the seeds of a vengeance that would simmer for a millennium. Exile transformed them. Without contact with their cousins, they turned inward, intensifying the very practices that had marked them as heretics. Over the centuries, they perfected their psionic gifts, developing technologies that amplified thought, will, and memory. Their culture grew around the conviction that they had been wronged, cast out not for crime, but for daring to evolve. Faith and science intertwined until the distinction between them dissolved, forming what became known as the Advent Unity. To belong to the unity was to surrender the illusion of individuality and live within the current of a shared destiny. Their leaders, seers empowered by the resonance of millions of minds, promised that one day they would return. When that day came, they vowed the galaxy would be remade in their image. The golden peace of the trade order ended abruptly 35 years ago when the Vasari Exodus fleet appeared without warning at the fringes of trader space. To humanity, they came not as desperate wanderers, but as conquerors. Their ships, bristling with alien weaponry, burst from phase space and overwhelmed defenses designed only to deter pirates and smugglers. Outlying worlds were devastated in mere days, their militias annihilated by technology that seemed decades, if not centuries, ahead of anything the trade order had ever fielded. Entire populations were enslaved, forced into labor to fuel the Vasari's relentless expansion. Survivors whispered of orbital bombardments that leveled cities, fleets that dismantled entire defense networks in hours, and occupation forces that crushed resistance with ruthless precision. These stories spread like wildfire, reaching the prosperous core worlds of the Order and shattering their complacency. A civilization that had grown used to resolving disputes in courtrooms and boardrooms now found itself staring into the abyss of extinction. After 1,000 years of prosperity, humanity was forced to relearn the meaning of war. The Trade Order's member worlds were slow to react. Centuries of peace had made them cautious, self-interested, and resistant to centralized authority. But desperation has a way of forging unity. After 3 years of chaos, the Trader Emergency Coalition emerged. Sovereignty was sacrificed for survival, and planets that had once been rivals set aside their differences. Merchant fleets were hastily converted into warships. Trade hubs were transformed into military command centers, and phase lanes, once bustling with goods, now bristled with defensive batteries. For the first time in generations, humanity's focus shifted entirely from profit to survival. At first, the Vasari advance seemed unstoppable. Their phase missiles cut through shields with terrifying ease, and their ability to strip planets of resources left barren husks in their wake. Each captured world became fuel for the next campaign, yet humanity proved resilient. Shipyards that once built freighters now churned out frigates and capital ships. Factories retooled to produce planetary shields, starbases, and heavy armor. In time, humanity discovered that sheer numbers, relentless logistics, and iron resolve could blunt even the might of the Vasari. Thus began a war of attrition unlike anything the galaxy had seen. The tech was forged in blood and fire, its people hardened by loss and united by necessity. Humanity learned to fight again, adapting tactics, building fortifications, and exploiting every weakness in the alien war machine. And though the Vasari had every advantage at the beginning, they soon discovered that humanity, cornered, desperate, and unwilling to surrender, would not be crushed so easily. Ten years after the Vasari first struck trader space, a second enemy emerged. The exiles of humanity, now calling themselves the Advent Unity, returned with fleets that shimmered with psychic power and alien elegance. While the tech was still locked in brutal combat with the Vasari, the Advent descended on the eastern fringes of trader territory. Their timing could not have been worse for humanity. Already reeling from years of bloodshed, the tech suddenly found itself fighting for survival on two fronts. The Advent did not attack like the Vasari. Where the alien conquerors advanced with ruthless logic and cold pragmatism, the Advent moved with zeal, their fleets guided as if by a single mind. Warships responded instantly to threats, maneuvering with uncanny precision, as though thought and machine were one. Their weapons did not simply destroy, they disoriented, destabilized, and dismantled. Enemy crews reported visions, hallucinations, and psychic assaults before being annihilated. Wherever the Advent triumphed, they sought not merely to conquer, but to convert. Entire populations were subsumed into the unity, stripped of individuality, and remade as willing servants of a greater cause. To those captured, resistance was said to melt away under the weight of collective thought, leaving only obedience to the unity. For the TEC, the pressure was unbearable. Vasari fleets pressed from one side, draining resources and enslaving colonies, while Advent Crusaders swept across the other, preaching vengeance and unity. Worlds that had stood for centuries fell in weeks. Trade hubs that had once pulsed with prosperity were silenced, their skies filled with burning wreckage. The once proud trade order was shattered, surviving only through the sheer industrial might and determination of its people. Yet neither invader achieved outright victory. The Vasari, slowed by humanity's growing defenses, could not maintain their rapid advance. The Advent, though terrifying in their conviction, underestimated humanity's stubborn resistance and the tech's ability to adapt. What followed was not conquest, but deadlock. For 20 long years, the galaxy became a battlefield of attrition, scarred by sieges, counterattacks, and unending bloodshed. Starbases rose at critical choke points, phase lanes were fortified, and defensive networks turned space itself into a labyrinth of guns and shields. Battles raged across dozens of systems, each victory paid for in blood and sacrifice, each defeat countered by sheer determination. The Vasari sought to drain worlds dry before retreating to the next, yet found themselves constantly harried by tech counter-strikes. The Advent attempted to spread their unity through captured populations, but conversion was slow, and every system taken drained their strength further. What began as a swift invasion by the Vasari and a righteous crusade by the Advent hardened into a grinding stalemate. Before we explore the Age of Rebellion, the fracturing of alliances, and the war as it looks in the present day, we will now briefly explore some of the capabilities, technology, and weapons of each faction, beginning with the Vasari. Said to be centuries or even millennia ahead of the tech in terms of technology, the Vasari wielded phase missile technology capable of bypassing shields entirely, adaptive armor that reshaped itself under fire, and advanced nanotech systems that repaired their ships faster than most enemies could damage them. Their fleets were smaller and more expensive to field, but each vessel was hardened with incredibly resilient hulls and armor. They excelled at mobility, deploying phase stabilizers that allowed entire armadas to leap across front lines and appear deep in enemy territory. Economic and military nanotech improved everything from armor plating to trade goods, while their unique ability to colonize volcanic worlds expanded their reach into hostile systems. Their scouts could even capture neutral extractors early, granting resource advantages the other factions could not match. They relied heavily on slave labor and the ruthless stripping of worlds to fuel their war effort. The Orculus starbase, mobile within gravity wells, gave them unmatched offensive and defensive potential in contested systems. They also wielded terrifying experimental superweapons like the Castura cannon, capable of destabilizing phase space and crippling enemy defenses across star systems. Next we have the Advent, a faction with technology roughly comparable to that of the Vasari. The Advent fought to reshape humanity in their image, harnessing psionic weaponry that could twist the minds of enemy crews, distortion fields that bent space itself, and fleets that operated as extensions of a single consciousness. Their ships were lightly armored but carried immense shield reserves, relying on psi-tech to enhance every aspect of combat. Anima drone strikecraft swarmed enemies in coordinated waves, piloted remotely through psychic links that made them faster and more numerous than conventional fighters. Advent capital ships, including the Radiance battleship and Progenitor mothership, acted as conduits for the Unity itself, projecting shields, amplifying allied firepower and sustaining fleets with restorative energies. They also wielded the Deliverance engine, a culture-based superweapon capable of spreading their influence across systems and undermining enemy resolve. To face the Advent was to fight not merely ships, but the collective mind and spirit of an entire civilization, fused into one. Finally, we have the Tech, a faction that fought simply to endure. Though primitive compared to their enemies, they compensated with sheer numbers, robust engineering, and economic might. Their fleets were built on mass production, with frigates and cruisers churned out at breakneck speed. Their capital ships, the Cole battleship, Sova carrier, Marza dreadnought, and Akan battlecruiser, were heavily armoured behemoths, designed to withstand punishment few others could. Static defences were another Tech hallmark. Argonev starbases bristled with Gauss turrets, missile pods, and meson cannons, able to anchor entire systems in defiance of alien advances. They also turned to experimental superweapons like the Novolith cannon, able to bombard planets from across the stars, demonstrating their belief that overwhelming firepower was the only true guarantee of security. After decades of bloodshed, the galaxy began to grow weary. The Tech, battered and strained by 30 years of unrelenting war, faced the reality that their people could not survive forever in a state of constant mobilization. Economies once powered by trade had been entirely repurposed for war, and even this colossal industrial engine showed signs of breaking under the pressure. Worlds that once thrived on commerce now starved, their populations rationed to the bare minimum in order to keep shipyards running. The Vasari, though still formidable, were troubled by whispers that their ancient pursuer, the unknown terror that had ended their empire, was once again drawing near. Entire fleets murmured in unease, wondering whether their flight across the stars had finally run out of time. And even within the Advent unity, which had always presented itself as a seamless collective, subtle cracks began to show. For the first time since the earliest battles, the thought of diplomacy surfaced, not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a desperate bid to avoid total collapse. Around a decade ago, envoys were cautiously dispatched across battle lines. For a fleeting moment, the galaxy seemed poised to consider compromise. Perhaps the great cycle of destruction could be broken. But the scars ran too deep. The Vasari could not abandon the paranoia of their long exodus, nor bring themselves to share the truth of their plight. The Advent, consumed by zeal and vengeance, saw compromise as weakness, a betrayal of destiny. The Tech, split between fear and rage, found themselves unable to present a unified vision for the future. Every conference ended in accusations, every promise met with suspicion. The dream of peace dissolved, and what could have been an end to the conflict instead became its grim expansion. Rather than unify, each civilization splintered under the pressure. Within the Tech, loyalists insisted that the only path forward was fortification and isolation, constructing vast bastions to protect humanity until its enemies tore each other apart. Their titan, the Ankelon, embodied this philosophy, a massive fortress bristling with armor, shields, and abilities designed to protect entire fleets. They believed endurance itself was victory. In contrast, Tech rebels seethed with fury, advocating for relentless offensives, punitive campaigns, and expansion at all costs. Their Ragnarov Titan symbolized this mindset, a colossal warship armed with devastating rail cannons capable of annihilating enemy capitals in a single volley. To the rebels, survival meant not just resisting, but eradicating every threat that had ever dared to challenge them. Among the Advent, the division was no less profound. Advent loyalists doubled down on their crusade of punishment, vowing to bring every human world to heel and erase the stain of their exile. They framed their campaign as holy destiny fulfilled, rallying behind the Coronata Titan, an awe-inspiring vessel that could subvert the wills of entire fleets and turn enemy crews into extensions of the Unity. In contrast, Advent rebels began to suspect corruption within the Unity itself. To them, the collective vision had been twisted by leaders who sought power rather than transcendence. They yearned to restore purity to their cause, embracing the Eradicate Titan, a warship built for sheer destructive might. To the rebels, true transcendence required purging corruption, even if it meant opposing the Unity's central will. The Vasari were fractured as well. Vasari loyalists clung to the ancient mantra of evacuate, siphon, run, continuing their endless retreat before the unknown horror pursuing them. They argued that to linger was suicide, that only perpetual flight could preserve their species. Their Verastra Titan embodied this philosophy, a massive mobile capital world able to drain entire planets to husks and seed gravity wells with phase gates, allowing the loyalists to sustain their exodus. Visari rebels, however, reached a breaking point. After 10,000 years of fleeing, they declared that survival demanded a final confrontation. They embraced the Kulturus Titan, a support warship that could heal allies while crippling enemies, and developed technologies to phase jump their Orculus starbases into hostile territory. They even considered forming alliances with former enemies to build a defense strong enough to withstand what was coming. Amid this unraveling, pirates grew bolder than ever. Once a nuisance easily kept in check by the Trade Order's patrols, they now found opportunity in the chaos. Other minor factions also began to play significant roles. The Pranast United, a breakaway tech enclave, emphasized defense and commerce, remaining within their own borders while providing valuable trade links to those willing to negotiate. The Jiskan Expeditionary Force, a wandering Vasari group, rejected colonization and instead dispatched swarms of scouts, quietly observing the galaxy and bartering intelligence to maintain influence. The Viturak Transport Cabal, another Vasari offshoot, emphasized mobility and exchange, presenting themselves as allies to many but remaining vulnerable to betrayal. More aggressive were the Aluxian Resurgents, militant tech secessionists who launched raids from their Terran homeworld and expanded into nearby systems, clashing with every major power they encountered. The result of this fracturing was chaos layered upon chaos. Civil wars erupted within each major faction, overlaying the broader galactic war. Former allies turned on each other. Fleets that once fought side by side now clashed in ideological vendettas. The front lines fragmented into dozens of unstable mini-conflicts, while pirate raids tore into the weakened infrastructure of every side. No world was safe, no alliance secure. Where once there had been a slim hope for diplomacy, there was now only division, betrayal, and escalating ruin. The saga of Sins of a Solar Empire has not yet reached its end. It remains a story still unfolding, with its factions locked in endless struggle. Yet, with Sins of a Solar Empire 2, the next chapter of this galactic conflict is beginning to emerge. This sequel promises a harsher, more adaptive galaxy. Fleets must develop new tactics, using shifting phase lanes to cut off opponents and strike where least expected. Economic and manufacturing systems are becoming more resilient, keeping supply lines open even as the war grows more desperate. The Vasari continue to advance in their mastery of phase technology, deploying strange new structures that empower devastating fleet maneuvers. The Advent, meanwhile, have spread across former trader worlds, their unity reaching a critical mass that allows them to act as a single overwhelming force bent on humanity's destruction. And now, reports of vanishing signals from both friend and foe alike suggest that an even greater confrontation is looming on the horizon, one that no faction can escape. The war is far from over, and the galaxy's fate remains uncertain. Sins of a Solar Empire 2 will carry this story forward, promising new revelations and perhaps deeper mysteries about the endless conflict that defines this universe. I'll be exploring these expansions as they arrive, diving into the evolving lore of this remarkable series, so be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. This video is not sponsored, but I wholeheartedly recommend experiencing Sins of a Solar Empire for yourself, alongside another of my all-time favorites, Supreme Commander. Both remain masterpieces of the strategy genre, worthy of recognition and play even today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.